Okay, great. We'll make a start. Welcome everyone to this IES webinar, the role of nature-based solutions in a just transition. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Sennan Mattar, researcher at Glasgow Caledonian University. His research focuses on sustainable development and just transitions. He lectures on environmental and sustainability issues as part of the MSc Climate Justice programme. In this webinar, Sennan will provide a brief overview of what is meant by just transition, where the idea came from, and how it relates to nature-based solutions and climate action. As always, there'll be the chance for questions at the end of the presentation, so please do submit these in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. You can do this at any point during the presentations, and I will then ask these on your behalf later on. Thank you very much for logging in. Great to see so many of you here, and I'll now hand over to Sennan. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. As we said, my aim is to provide you a background in the short time we're together on what a just transition is, what the concept means to different people, as well as how it cuts across multiple sectors. And as we go through this, I will demonstrate how a nature-based solutions fits within the narrative of a just transition. So what is a just transition? If you've heard the term before, you will have likely heard it in context of a decarbonisation agenda. In essence, there is a concern that transition from a high carbon to a low carbon economy could have detrimental effects on the economy and livelihood of people, particularly in high carbon industries. In recent years, a just transition has meant finding ways to transition to this low carbon economy in a way that is fair to workers and communities, invests in new green jobs and addresses issues of inequality and poverty. But there are many articulations of just transition depending on who you talk to. Trade unions place very strong, heavy emphasis on social dialogue, worker protections, as an industry's future is put on notice, and they look at compensation and retraining as recourses when discussing a just transition. Activists tend to be more concerned with the impact of transition on communities and what an emerging industry might mean for them. Governments and institutions often express their understanding of a just transition by talking about job creation, infrastructure planning, and the sustainable development goals. Whereas academics talk about pretty much everything. But depending on the organization, these discussions might have a specific focus on how to best manage a local community undergoing a transition, or much larger scale, such as international frameworks. But the essence of just transition is this pathway for social justice. Now, the Just Transition Alliance, an organization founded by trade union and environmental activists in the 90s, provides one of the clearest definitions you will come across. That is, the concept is a principle, a process, and a practice. The principle being that you can have an economy and a good environment, a challenge to the view that environmental destruction is a byproduct, an inevitable byproduct of environmental destruction. A process meaning a just transition is a framework for managing and monitoring change with fairness as an overarching objective. And a practice, i.e. a way of ensuring a transition is participatory and actively involves workers and communities in the creation of policies that will affect them. I feel it's worth noting that as many of you in the audience will probably be aware, just transitions and sustainable development goals are often lumped together during these types of discussions. This is typical because a just transition is currently a policy discussion. It is an aspiration, not yet standard for a transition to a low carbon economy. Hence, if you've heard of a just transition, it will be through the lens of a policy discussion on sustainable development, most likely. Therefore, governments and international organisations are the usual actors who seem to be engaging with this concept. And this is, after all, because the SDGs were designed to be pursued by national governments. And if you accept you cannot achieve sustainable development, if you're marginalizing communities during that development, then the concept of a just transition becomes very important for governments to recognize. Yet the just transition has a broader history than this. And it's through this broader history we'll be able to see how just transition can be applied in many different sectors, including nature-based solutions. So just where did it come from? This movement started as a trade union movement in the 70s and 90s, alongside the environmental justice movement in the US, as a response to growing concerns around environmental hazards in communities and the workplace. The just transition movement was a challenge to the jobs versus environment narrative that heavy industry said would be the result of environmental regulation. It is during this time that the principle that you can have both a good economy and environment became the rallying cry of just transition. Rather than a purely technological or engineering focus on environmental challenges, as financed through super funds, the just transition movement argued that social challenges also needed to be considered. And this is where this idea of a super fund for workers was suggested. And as any good trade unionist demands, the just transition movement argued workers should have a role in the decision-making process when it came to enacting many of these suggestions. But it was in 1995 when this principle, this idea of process and practice is written down and coined as just transition. Since then, the concept has found its way into mainstream policymaking. There were attempts by the trade unions consistently since the 90s to have just transition recognized as a policy option when it came to climate policy, but it was only in the Paris Agreement in 2015 where just transition is actually accepted into an international treaty, although it is phrased in taking into account, which is not very strong language, but it was still a success for the movement that had been trying so long to have this concept recognized as a legitimate policy option. And this is when the concept begins to appear more prominently in policy discussions, as the Just Transition Declaration was signed by 50 countries, although only a quarter of those present at COP24. Again, with this focus on jobs, infrastructure, social dialogue, and greater cooperation. Again, just transition is often talked about in terms of decarbonisation, but again, it is the focus on workers and communities and what a transition means for them. Although this COP had limited success in driving up ambition or coming up with any new thinking on exactly how we might go about addressing climate change, there was a point made by Bert D. Well, the policy officer of the International Trade Union Confederation, when he said, never ever before had climate negotiators debated so much about the impacts of energy transition on workers and their communities. And so this is when we really start seeing just transition becoming a more common word that we are having to get to grips with as we seek to how it might apply to our own sectors. And so we are seeing that more governments adopt just transition as a framework to do exactly that for climate action and economic development. Scotland is a good example with its Just Transition Commission, a product following COP24. Again, this focus on investment, jobs, and social issues is a common theme of just transition discussions, particularly at international, national level. But the concept is not limited to a single sector, but rather requires just transition to be considered across multiple sectors, like this commission does as an advisor to the Scottish Government. This is all building to the fact that the just transition is not limited to decarbonisation, as is commonly discussed, but has implications for a range of different sectors and issues. Its applicability is tied to the fact it is a principle, it is a process and a practice that can be applied in numerous contexts, one of which is nature-based solutions. There is little doubt nature-based solutions will be part of a transition to a green, low-carbon economy, particularly in urban areas. Cities are growing urbanizing, the world is urbanizing at an increasing rate, meaning there will be a lot more citizens in very confined, quite concentrated environments. Nature-based solutions have often been most strongly argued when it comes to cities, both as a business opportunity as well as addressing the significant concentrated environmental challenges which are often found there. Nature-based solutions are also very useful options for pursuing climate mitigation, such as the enhancing of carbon sinks through effective management of peatlands. But perhaps more crucially, nature-based solutions will form a key tool as our societies learn to cope and adapt to a changing climate. Green spaces combating heat island effect in cities just be one example, which would be a very useful, and it will be a very important role as the world warms. It's also worth mentioning green spaces have also been shown through research to enhance physical and mental well-being through access to spaces to exercise and relax. Research, I might add, which has a very long history. The oldest paper I have come across on this topic was published in 1890. Also, the solutions such as urban agriculture is an example of a nature-based solution which can encourage consumer behavioural change. As one research points to how the cultivation, of agriculture helped with place building, community identity, through a shared purpose. So there are multiple, beyond the ecological and environmental benefits of nature-based solutions that are very much in our mind when it comes to this. And importantly, nature-based solutions offer a route to sustainable development, the creation of jobs that coexist with the environment, not to its detriment. However, I raised a question, does green mean just? A long-standing challenge to the implementation of nature-based solutions and green infrastructure has been uncertainty whether the benefit of these interventions actually reach the poorest and the most vulnerable. Because although this is definitely an emerging area of looking at nature-based solutions through a justice and equity lens, there is research to show disadvantaged communities in urban areas have struggled to access and benefit from nature-based solutions, green infrastructure and green spaces more generally. A lot of research on the inaccessibility of green spaces in particular. That's because urban areas in particular are known for an uneven distribution of environmental goods and services. Nature-based solutions can help address these inequalities, but it cannot do so while ignoring the larger structural issues present in cities, mainly to do with class or racial groups, which have reinforced inequalities in urban environments for a very long time. And I'll give you one example, looking at the distribution of green space in Berlin, one of the greenest cities in Europe. But even in Berlin, residents living in walking distance of parks are typically from higher socioeconomic groups and with greater social standing. Whereas the high density areas of Berlin, which are often categorized by having a larger immigrant population, have considerably, disproportionately less access to these green spaces. And despite many living in close proximity to other areas which have had investment into green spaces and other green infrastructure. This is essentially pointing to a growing body of research on the potential. There's also, this leads on to this growing body of research for the potential for nature-based solutions and green infrastructure to cause gentrification in cities, as improved quality of the local environment has commercial consequences for property values, and this has been shown in some studies to reinforce inequalities and further socially exclude marginalized communities. Perhaps a very good example would be New York's High Line, built on an abandoned train spur, an aerial greenway. It was created by local activists who saved it from demolition. It became one of the most popular areas in New York, attracting millions of visitors, as well as enhancing the biodiversity of the area. But also as a result of its popularity, between 2003 and 2011, property values in the zone increased by 103%, and $2 billion was invested in property development. This is how essentially greening areas or nature-based solutions do have a potential to cause gentrification, with consequences for lower economic groups. Now, these uneven distribution of benefits and burdens has spurred some scholars to consider the social and environmental implications of nature-based solutions. And this is only correct given the growing advocacy of nature-based solutions to address climate change. The place of equity and justice in policy making and planning of nature-based solutions must be looked at. Now, there is this, how this might be looked at is that nature-based solutions should be done in partnership with communities, championing their knowledge, championing their rights, supporting livelihoods, reducing vulnerability, but only by actually involving communities in the planning and discussions around nature-based solutions can that be achieved. And this has been a common theme which is coming from studies looking at just transition and nature-based solution. This idea that they should be designed and shared according to community concerns, needs, and desires, rather than the conventional urban design or looking at purely ecological restoration. In addition, if we were to look at nature-based solutions in terms of how they might apply in a developing context, we have to make sure that land ownership and issues around governments are also considered as an equity issue in nature-based solutions, as as there is concern, particularly in some of the areas I've worked in Zambia, that if protection of particular forests and areas which completely shut out the local community who use it as a source of firewood, that there is no management, there is no equity applied. It's a pure ecological project. The consequence is a energy poverty among the local population, as the transition has happened to create carbon sinks, to create or to protect carbon sinks, but without an alternative just solution for those with the least capacity to make that transition. And I mention this, however, there are very few examples of initiatives that have embraced equity and justice as a framework for nature-based solutions. We can point to challenges, but there are actually very few initiatives we can point to as saying have worked with equity and justice as a very strong framework. Now, the World Conservation Union, with its members of 270 governments and over 1,000 NGOs, have promoted nature-based solutions. But some scholars have argued not enough attention has been given to the ethical issues that have been promoted in some of these projects, and that this can risk undermining the effectiveness of climate policy by ignoring underlying social barriers to climate action. Again, this is to make the point, just transition is an aspiration, but not yet standard. I think it would be good to give you some visual examples to demonstrate this. This research was done by my colleagues at GCU and at the Centre for Climate Justice. Mr. Makinjudani is a PhD student with our centre focused on green infrastructure in Glasgow City and the implication for just transition. I encourage you to keep an eye out for his thesis when it finishes. Very interesting reading. But this paper modelled the potential for green infrastructure, such as green spaces, parks, and waterways, to provide cooling for the general Glasgow area and most deprived areas. And I'll quickly move through. So, Glasgow area is prone to flooding, and the extreme weather events have been increasing, recorded in Glasgow. So there's been a strong view for green infrastructure to help deal with overheating and mitigating against flood. But this study also wanted to look at how green infrastructure benefited the most deprived areas in Glasgow. And what you see in this map is the 10% most deprived areas in Glasgow. So they wanted to look at the potential, and they estimated the potential of green infrastructure to provide cooling and to mitigate flood risk. And they looked at how that related in space, in proximity to deprived areas. So what you see in this area, in this image, is their estimate of cooling potential by Glasgow's green infrastructure. In the next slide, they illustrate this potential, but only for the 10% most deprived areas in Glasgow. If you were to watch closely, as you can see, the potential benefit of this green infrastructure to cool only extended to a few of the most deprived areas. Similarly, if you compare the potential for green infrastructure to mitigate flooding, here for the Glasgow general area and the 10 most deprived areas, you'll again see the benefit does not extend as extensively to the most deprived areas. essentially, this study showed that deprived communities in Glasgow City were more likely to be impacted negatively by heat waves or flooding compared to more affluent areas. And I certainly recommend you have a full read of this paper, and I've provided it's titled there for you to look up. But it's a very good paper, and short in summary, it has some very interesting findings. So I hope this helps put the potential benefits of the nature-based solutions into a just transition context. Nature-based solutions help us to pursue climate action through mitigation adaptation, as well as improve livelihoods and well-being. But for a nature-based solution to also contribute to a just transition, this requires the principle, the process, and the practice that I've covered to be integral to planning and execution of nature-based solutions. So this essentially means addressing societal challenges, increasing community participation, and empowering the marginalized, because those are most at risk of being left behind in a just transition. While nature-based solutions can be used to achieve a green transition, what we need is just nature-based solutions so that that transition is also fair and equitable. Thank you.
Thank you, Sennan. That was really interesting. Really appreciate you taking the time to give that presentation. A lot of interesting food for thought about how the two concepts of a just transition and nature-based solutions can fit together. Please, anyone, all attendees, put your questions in the Q&A function, and I can ask these on your behalf. Before I get started with attendee questions, I just wanted to ask a quick one, Sennan, about with COP26 being held in Glasgow this year, what would you like to see from the conference that would help move the idea of a just transition as a practice and build on the Just Transition Declaration from COP24?
Essentially, I would want to see community participation high up on the priority. It is an unusual circumstance that we often design environmental solutions for communities where no one has visited, or we have no real idea on the ground of what's faced or how they might work in practice. I always say you'd think that is a very obvious thing to pursue when designing solutions for local environmental challenges, that you talk to the people there, but it is not common practice. So we have a lot of top-down approaches. Just transition requires you to talk to people. So that's a very strong emphasis we need to bring to COP, because if that is not involved, then we can make all the plans in the world, but they won't be effective in practice.
Great, thank you. I'll just move to some of the questions in the Q&A function, and then we've got a couple of people with their hands up who I'll turn to in a minute. So one question is, do you think that local authorities and urban planners should be responsible for the inequalities that green infrastructure can cause, and should they be in charge of ensuring that this green infrastructure does fit with just transition objectives?
That's a very interesting question. I would essentially say it can't only be city officials, because they don't necessarily control the broader infrastructure challenges, but at the same time, they have a huge responsibility when it comes to the planning of green infrastructure and other nature-based solutions, because most city policies, when it comes to urban planning, often use green infrastructure as a way of aesthetically approving an area, not necessarily with the idea of just green enough, as in just able to actually provide a function. They're looking at it as a more for amenity to improve the look of an area for commercial reasons, to improve foot flow to the high streets. And that's a very common approach, and you can see the logic behind that because that's what they're most focused on. But they do have a very huge responsibility. Thankfully in Glasgow, they do take that very seriously, and I know they're actually trying to use their green infrastructure to look more than just to look pretty, but to actually serve us as a function.
Oh, that's great to hear. That's really good. Thank you. I'm now going to turn to one of our attendees with their hands up. Ella Knight, did you want to say your question? You'll just need to unmute yourself.
Oh yeah, it was pretty much what the other person asked, so it's pretty much already been answered. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. Thank you.
You also did mention objectives, just transition objectives. I should say, actually specifying what a just transition objective it has not been nailed down yet. As I said, there's these different articulations of just transition. So how do you measure fairness? Obviously in the paper I showed you, one way they used green infrastructure as almost a proxy for fairness. But is that an applicable measure in every single city, in all contexts? It probably won't be. So that's a much deeper conversation, but I think it's going to happen, particularly if nature-based solutions are going to start becoming more prominent as a mitigation and adaptation option, as they try to implement them in cities which are very socially alive areas, very hard to get things right in cities. So it will involve a lot of dialogue, a lot of research in this area, which is just emerging. But I would just mention that it's hard to say what a just transition objective metric, however you want to call it, is at the moment. But we have some idea of the broader themes.
Yeah, that's actually links to one of the other questions from an attendee in here, which is about defining what is just and how you would measure that. So I think that's kind of answered their question there, and how more research is needed in this area to really nail that down a bit. So thank you for that. I'll now hand over to Alan. I can see that you've got your hand up if you want to say your question. And again, you'll need to unmute. Alan, are you there? Okay, we'll come back to Alan in a minute. I'll move over to another attendee question. How do you think that nature-based solutions like green infrastructure can be implemented in water-stressed areas, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa?
That's a very good one. With great difficulty, I imagine, because, I mean, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, the desertification and more erratic rainfall is making access to water an increasing difficulty. Although common misconception that there is not a lot of water in Africa is actually not true. There's plenty. It's simply when it falls and when it is needed is a disconnect. So nature-based solutions, ways of actually allowing water to stay within the use of communities will require considerable investment. But the challenge is at the moment of actually, and I know a lot of African nations have nationally determined contributions, which specifically say they will do some of these projects. They have the capacity, they have the will, or they're willing to do technology shares with developed nations and other researchers, but it's always conditional on financing. And what they're seeing at the moment is, because of the coronavirus, priorities on reallocation of finance. So I think at the moment, particularly in the next 5 years, one of the bigger challenges facing actually getting nature-based solutions in sub-Saharan Africa is going to come down to are developed nations willing to essentially take more of the financial risk for projects which may or may not work.
Yeah, that makes sense. And one of our attendees is reflecting on that, and they've said that as a sub-Saharan African in Cape Town, having survived day zero and working for the City of Cape Town Metropolitan Municipality, these options are critical. But as you noted, funding and priorities are the controller. So yeah, just a reflection on that. We've got another question here asking about good practice models for engagement with communities. They're saying that in their experience, consultative processes can be very slow and can be unpredictable in their effectiveness of their outcomes. So how do you balance that input with timely planning implementation?
Oh, that's a fantastic question, because I couldn't agree more. They can be unpredictable. There's also the this comes across in resilience researchers a lot, is does the community members actually have the required skill and knowledge to be able to make informed decisions when it comes to adaptation? That question is posed. But of course, the counter to that is that if the community you're going to participate doesn't have the requisite skills and knowledge and resources to effectively contribute to forming solutions to their own environmental issues, that's where you start. You provide the skills, training, and knowledge so that they can be an equal partner in decision making. And I say that with the full realization that as someone who has applied for grants and research funding and various other projects, funding for pre-consultation or training of your consultees before you go and consult with them is incredibly niche, and no one does it or funds it at the very least. So I'd say that comes down to actually the way our priorities are set and are very focused on project oriented rather than a series of programs is a huge barrier to us actually doing, as you say, being able to consult properly in a way which is actually useful to everyone involved. But it must always be attempted, because the alternative is designing adaptation projects which are resisted by local communities. And if you look at my colleague, Dr. Michael Mekovic, you'll find many papers by him on precisely that, of professionals coming to communities saying, here is a project which will help you deal with climate change and face fierce resistance, because, well, of very various reasons. But it must always, it just illustrates the point that it's not a box ticking exercise. There is a purpose here to consulting with people, but they have to be empowered to, in some circumstances, to actually be an equal partner in that.
Yeah, that sounds really important. Thank you. And another reflection from someone here that's saying that should also be taken, that local knowledge is also really important, and would also feed well into those consultations.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And I think you kind of answered this one from what we've just talked about, but this is talking about engagement from marginalized or rural communities when environmental goals or nature-based solutions are in direct contrast to their own lives. For example, allowing farmland on floodplains to flood to protect river ecosystems from dredging. And I imagine this would be the same thing, as you need to engage with them early on. Is that how you would approach that question, to answer that question?
Yeah, it's understanding that there are different priorities and different needs going on simultaneously. These issues can't be looked in isolation. They all need to be had at the same time. The trick is always to do it in a way where everyone's not all shouting at once in the same room. But if it was easy, everyone would do it. So the priority here is consulting with a genuinely enabling environment. That's what we need to get to. It's not standard practice though, as I say. It's what we aspire to.
Great, thank you. And the final question here is about the more technical aspect of nature-based solutions, and it's talking about the manufacture of building materials which are often used in these zero carbon projects and green infrastructure, and how they can often include toxic materials, and the idea that we could create new manufacturing based on bio-based materials such as sheep wool, hemp, wood fibre. Do you think this would help to make these nature-based solutions more amenable with a just transition?
I would say those sort of measures are necessary to make it more sustainable. If you're looking at supply chains on how, if your sustainable projects are causing harm elsewhere, then it's an odd question, because then I would argue that they're not that sustainable then. You cannot have a sustainable development if it's marginalising or causing harm elsewhere. And we often focus on the environmental and economic aspect of sustainable development. But the third one, that's social, is always present. A just transition essentially means you can't ignore those detrimental effects. So then you have to go back to the supply chain. You have to see where it's coming from. Have those individuals who are now manufacturing potentially toxic measures, are they part of this transition? They are part of the transition. Are they part of a just transition? In that circumstance, as you described, I would say no, but that's a conversation to be had. Definitely.
Well, thank you, Sennan. And yeah, I think that kind of agrees with the attendees' point of some of these so-called green infrastructure projects can slightly be greenwashing when they kind of involve supply chains which aren't sustainable. But thank you, that was really interesting. Really appreciate you taking the time today. And thank you again to all of our attendees as well for coming and being so engaged. I hope you all found this beneficial and informative. This webinar has been recorded and will be made available on the IES website and YouTube channel. And just to let you know that this webinar is part of a series exploring nature-based solutions and the fundamental role they play in meeting climate ambitions, restoring ecosystems and protecting biodiversity. And this is being done as part of our activities on our stages on the road to COP26. The next webinar in this series will be held next week on the 5th of May, and we'll be exploring nature-based solutions for soil health. Please do register for this on our website. Thank you again, Sennan, and thank you to all of you for attending. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.